Well, howdy, y'all. Time to talk about the Wild West. Gunslingers, saloon girls, thank you kindly, rough and tumble good old days where Americans could get rich by pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. You know that's not what the West was like, right? Of course it was. I've seen every John Wayne movie. You know, bad guys wear the black hats and the good guys wear the white hats. There's shootouts and tumbleweed rolls across the street while they're shooting at each other. No, you're talking about Hollywood. You're not actually talking about history. Well, the West was at least a land of opportunity where anyone could strike it rich if they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. A wide open space where no one lived.
There's nobody here.
And people could just go out into the frontier and make a whole new start all by themselves. Now you're referring to something called the myth of the West, and that's the topic of today's lesson.
The West, young man, haven't you been told California's full of whiskey? Women.
Okay guys, in all seriousness, there are a lot of myths associated with the West. It has been completely mythologized in our culture by Hollywood movies and dime store novels that have been out since the time of the Old West, when even then it was this idyllic place, completely empty, devoid of anything. You could go out into the open wilderness and just start a homestead and basically live off the land all by yourself. That's not reality. First of all, what's the big issue here with this wide open space? Anyone? Well, first of all, it wasn't actually a wide open space.
Yes, a land empty of human existence. What the fuck are these guys?
There were lots of people who lived there. Not only were there Native Americans who were often driven off of their land into reservations in order to accommodate white settlement, but there were also people who were living in this area, in the New Mexico, Texas area, who had formerly been part of Mexico until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo brought that land into the United States. So basically, the myth of the West is this really common theme we see in history and in our society, which promoted the idea of this vast, wild land waiting to be tamed. This was promoted widely because travel started to become easier to the West and people wanted to keep this idea going. The West was viewed as this great untapped frontier, and there was a new notion of manifest destiny taking over the American psyche. This is the belief that it was America's mission to expand from ocean to ocean, spreading democracy and freedom. Doesn't that just sound nice? The problem is democracy and freedom for who? Yes, they were spreading the American ideals out west, but there were people living there that certainly were not experiencing democracy and freedom. Native Americans in particular were greatly harmed by westward expansion, and so were Mexican Americans living in this area, as well as other groups such as the Chinese Americans who had settled in the West looking for gold. Americans believed it was their God-given duty to conquer the Western territories and unify the nation. They thought that they were to expand from sea to shining sea. It's even immortalized in our song America the Beautiful, which says, "America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea." One of the major reasons that people started to spread out west was thanks to the Transcontinental Railroad, which was approved in 1862 by the Republican Congress and was looked at as a gateway to the West. The government granted over 200 million acres of land for the project and offered low interest rate loans. The railroad ran from Sacramento, California to Omaha, Nebraska. And it's interesting, in Omaha, Nebraska, they actually do have a railroad museum that commemorates the Transcontinental Railroad. The Union Pacific Railroad began laying track westward out of Omaha, and the Central Pacific Railroad began laying track eastward out of Sacramento. However, as mentioned before, the West actually was not empty, not by any means. It was highly populated. There were 350,000 Native Americans living west of the Mississippi. They used to number 1 million until Europeans came to the New World, and through a combination of intentional and unintentional means, their numbers had been dwindling. Bison also played a substantial role, and in order to make sure that the railroad could go out west, they put bounties on the heads of bison, which encouraged white people to go out and hunt them. This actually significantly affected the numbers of bison that were on the Great Plains. About 30 million buffalo used to graze the plains. Westward expansion caused further tension, and Europeans began to break former treaties looking for wealth in the West. And if you notice this picture here on your PowerPoint, that is a hill of bison heads. Those are bison that were killed in order to make way for the railroad. Without the bison, Native Americans became more and more dependent on the government, which meant it was much easier for them to be herded onto reservations. And by the late 1870s, Indians had largely succumbed to the US military. The Dawes Act, for example, ended tribal rule and divided Indian land into 160-acre parcels. Remember the Jeffersonian ideal that we talked about in the last lesson, the idea that land ownership would make one self-sufficient? They wanted to force Native American tribes to live in a more European fashion. This led Native Americans to resist in whatever way possible. Sometimes it led to outright rebellion. Sometimes it led to acts of civil disobedience that sometimes even led to violence. One of these was the ghost dance. This is a dance from a vision that a man in the Paiute tribe had. He believed performing the dance would bring back the buffalo and make the white men disappear. However, white people seeing the dance thought it was some type of war dance. They thought that the Native Americans were actually planning to attack them. And so they decided to strike preemptively in what became known as the Massacre at Wounded Knee. So why were people so interested in going out west anyway? I mean, surely there had to be something to the hype, right? Well, in 1848, gold was discovered in California, which started out the idea in people's minds that the West was a place you could go to strike it rich. Thousands of Americans headed west. They were lured by the idea of becoming instant millionaires. The West became known as this land of opportunity. However, the reality of mining was really quite different. Miners were actually paid about $4 a day, which barely covered their expenses. Still, the low-pay and dangerous work actually led to the formation of unions. These unions, however, excluded Chinese, Mexican, and Indian workers. So even though they were helpful and they did fight for the workers' rights, they were only helpful to certain groups of workers, specifically white workers. So where did we get our idea of the cowboy? A cowboy is actually someone who works in the cattle industry, and cattle ranching in the West became increasingly dominated by big business, which meant there was actually a lot of work to be had in cattle ranching. However, in reality, it was actually a rather mundane job. The most famous part of this, the kind that ends up in most cowboy stories, is something called the Long Drive. It was a 1,500-mile drive along the Chisholm Trail. Now, if you close your eyes and picture a cowboy, you're probably picturing someone who looks a bit like John Wayne. Probably pretty gruff, definitely white, definitely male. And this is not necessarily what a cowboy actually was in the West. In fact, there were lots of Black and Mexican cowboys. They were very common, though they often faced racial discrimination. Commercial ranches absorbed cowboys into their expanding operations, and so this was one type of work that was available to a wide segment of the population, so they definitely weren't all white. Another thing that drew people out west was the Homestead Act of 1862. The US government actually encouraged people to head out west. The 1862 Homestead Act gave millions of acres away for free in the West to anyone that would claim land and live on it for 5 years. It was basically on a first-come, first-served basis, and there were some rules. You had to show that you could develop the land, you had to build a structure on it, the structure had to fit a certain criteria, but if you did that, you could get this land for free. Other public land was also sold for $2.50 an acre, which was still pretty cheap. As far as women in the West, women worked in mining camps as domestics in boarding houses, hotels, and private homes. Legal prostitution accounted for the largest segment of the female workforce. Although women came out in smaller numbers, they still found ways to head out west. They were responsible for making the home bearable, and a surprisingly large number of single women staked out homestead claims by themselves. After settling in, women of the West began directing their energies to moral reform and extending democracy on the frontier. They thought of it as their duty to tame the Wild West. They thought that women were particularly instrumental in bringing society to the frontier. Now, there were fewer women than men in the West, and the most common ways that women went out were either as the wives of settlers, this happened quite a bit, mail order brides, which were also very popular, and the reason was there were women in the East who maybe wanted to go west, but were looking for a way to get out there because women didn't have the same type of mobility in society that men did. One way they could do that was by advertising themselves as a mail order bride, agreeing to marry someone in the West in exchange for passage to the West. One way that women could make money was through working at dance halls. Dance halls were places where men could go and they could simply dance with women. This might seem kind of odd to modern women who might have at one point tried to drag their significant other to some type of dance, But at the time, this was one of the only ways that men and women could interact and even touch each other. They would pay certain women to dance with them. That's all they would do. These were not prostitutes. They were just there to dance, and they would actually make money from men paying to dance with them. Women in the West fought for issues such as temperance and women's suffrage. Temperance means trying to ban the use of alcohol, which was a huge problem in the West. Western states also became some of the first to grant suffrage to women. Kansas, for example, granted women's suffrage in 1887. This is because women played a huge part in Western society. The roles in the West were not quite as rigid. A lot of the philanthropists and people who did manage to strike it rich out west were women, sometimes even madams who ran saloons. And so women were looked at in a completely different way in the West than they had been looked at in the East, which meant that Western states were sometimes more likely to grant women the right to vote or to trust women with certain political roles than people in the East. The West was also a very diverse place, not just culturally and racially, but also in terms of religion. One group that originated out east and eventually made their way to the West were the Mormons, who sought refuge in the West for religious reasons, particularly in the Utah Territory. Mormons of the time believed in a practice of polygamy, which means marrying more than one wife. They actually held this as the most important practice of their faith. The problem was that marriage to more than one person was illegal in the US, and so they were driven out of many places for this practice. So they headed further and further out west to a place where they could have their family structure the way they wanted to in peace. The practice of polygamy was not outlawed until Utah attempted to become a state. In order to become a state, the government insisted that polygamy had to be outlawed. There were also Californios, or people of Spanish and Mexican heritage, who established themselves as farmers and ranchers. Another major group in the West were Chinese immigrants. They migrated mostly to California because of dislocation related to the British Opium Wars, family feuds, and a peasant rebellion in China. They were attracted by the gold rush, but in reality, most of them found work in building the Transcontinental Railroad. However, the Chinese faced specific exclusions in the West, things that other racial groups didn't have to deal with. One of them was the Chinese Exclusion Act. This banned Chinese immigration into the United States and prohibited those Chinese already in the country from becoming naturalized American citizens. A law that remained on the books for far too long and was still an issue during World War II, which we'll talk about later. So I might be showing my age here, but one of the first video games I ever remember playing was the Oregon Trail, and I can't even count the number of times a member of my party was either killed in a river or died of dysentery. However, the Oregon Trail was actually a real thing, and especially before the railroads, this was the primary way of getting out west. It was a 2,170-mile route. Unfortunately, it was also very dangerous. You had to leave at just the right time, because if you missed your window, you could get stuck in the mountains, and that's exactly what happened to the Donner Party, who are most known for cannibalizing each other when they got stuck in the mountains over a particularly harsh winter. Everything went wrong for this party. Not only did they end up leaving a little late, they tried to take a faster route, which ended up being a longer route. They got stuck in the mountains because of an early winter, and so they just had all the bad luck. There were survivors of this party, and the survivors tended to be middle-aged women. However, those that lived did not live without eating basically anything that was edible, including their own dead. Alternatives to the Oregon Trail included by ship, which was also a very long route, or by railroad, which was not an option for a long time until the railroad actually connected the east to west with the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1865, America had 50,000 miles of railroad, primarily in the northern states, but it had no railroads in the west. America experienced a tremendous railroad boom after the Civil War. Over 150,000 miles of track was built between 1865 and 1895, and this was all made possible thanks to the Man of Steel. Just kidding. No, not that one. That's the one. Before 1850, railroads and trains were made of iron. The problem is iron is brittle, and railroads were unreliable and under constant repair. In 1850, Henry Bessemer from England invented a way to turn iron ore into steel. Steel had all the strength of iron, but with the flexibility to withstand the pressures of being used to build taller buildings longer bridges, and of course, railroads. Steel is lighter, stronger, and much more malleable than iron. And steel was inexpensive. This meant that railroad track could be laid much easier than it could before. Bessemer opened the door to an industrial revolution in America. It was a new age of building that began with skyscrapers, bridges, and railroads, all brought to you by steel, and the man of steel in particular. Now, before we get too excited about what a wonderful invention railroads are, it's important to look at the people who actually worked on them, because they were often underpaid and doing incredibly dangerous work, sometimes with no one fighting for their rights, especially in the case of immigrants. Most people who worked on the railroads were immigrant workers from either China or Ireland. A lot of the workers who worked on the railroads were actually very badly used, and it's important to remember that when talking about the railroad. However, we can't deny that this was an incredible feat of engineering in the United States. And on May 10th, 1869, at Promontory Point, Utah, the Golden Spike was driven into the ground, uniting both the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads. This was the first railroad line connecting the East to the West. Travel time was about 4 to 5 days from New York to California. This greatly changed the way people travel in the United States and basically opened up a door to the West like nothing had ever done before. With this in mind, it seemed nothing could stop Manifest Destiny. So where does this idea of the myth of the West come from? Well, there were people in the West that gained a lot of status as these mythical figures. They tended to be idealized as Robin Hood-like characters. They were often involved in criminal activity, and yet they were still romanticized in some way. Some of the more famous ones are Nat Love, who was a former slave, and Wild Bill Hickok, and Buffalo Bill Cody. William, or Buffalo Bill Cody, was actually one of the main reasons that the myth of the West became such a standard part of our culture. Cody's own theatrical genius revealed itself in 1883 when he organized Buffalo Bill's Wild West, an outdoor extravaganza that dramatized some of the most picturesque elements of frontier life. He showed a hunt with real buffaloes, an Indian's attack on a Deadwood stage with real Indians, a Pony Express ride, a tableau presentation of Custer's Last Stand with some people who had actually been there playing the part of the Lakota, some real Lakota Indians. So he tried to bring these elements of the West to life, but with a dramatic flair. So these things became larger than life in the American imagination. We can't talk about cowboys without talking about New Mexico's own contribution to the myth of the West, and that is Billy the Kid. There are lots of myths about Billy the Kid. We have greatly idealized Billy the Kid in New Mexico, and there are some people who love him and some people who hate him, but here's just a few myths. 1. At the age of 12, Billy the Kid killed his first man, who insulted his mother. After the killing, he bid his mother farewell and ran away. This is a myth. That didn't happen. Billy the Kid's first crime was actually that he stole some laundry. He got locked up and he was scared that he was going to be in prison forever because he was a kid, and he escaped. That was his first crime. It wasn't some, major murder or something like that. Myth number 2. Billy the Kid killed 21 men, one for each year of his life. This is a myth. He did kill a lot of people, but it wasn't 21. Myth number 3. Billy the Kid was left-handed. As a left-handed person, I think this would be awesome. Unfortunately, it's not true. The reason that we think he's left-handed is because the way that they took portraits in the past was through a mirror image. It didn't flip it around the way a modern image is. So when you see a picture of Billy the Kid, he appears to be holding a gun in his left hand. But in reality, he was holding it with his right hand. So unfortunately, he was not left-handed. Over here, we see the most commonly known picture of Billy the Kid. However, it's not the only one anymore. Recently, we actually found another one, and this is it. Someone actually found this in their attic and said it was a picture of Billy the Kid, and it has actually been authenticated that this is a true picture of Billy the Kid. So how exciting that we found this new picture. Let's talk about some of the realities. He was born Henry McCarty, September 17th of 1859, but he changed his name to William H. Bonney, which is the name other than Billy the Kid that he's most known for. He's an incredibly controversial figure. He is known mostly for having participated in the Lincoln County War that took place in Lincoln, New Mexico. This is an incredibly tiny town in New Mexico, kind of near Ruidoso. And every year they have a pageant where they have Billy the Kid days, and they reenact Billy the Kid's escape from a jail there. I also saw a t-shirt there that said most dangerous street in the world, 1888, and I would have to agree because the town of Lincoln is actually one street, and 1888 was the year that the Lincoln County War took place. So Billy the Kid was known to have killed 8 men, not 21, 8 men. Still a lot. You still shouldn't kill 8 men, but it wasn't 21, not one for each year of his life. He was killed himself on July 14th, 1881 by Pat Garrett. Pat Garrett is actually a pretty cool figure too. He lived in Mesilla and Las Cruces, so he's a local, and he claimed afterwards to have been best friends with Billy the Kid. This is highly debatable. However, he was the officer who eventually ended up killing Billy the Kid. Interestingly, my husband's great-grandfather, Manuel Preciado, actually knew Pat Garrett when he was a kid. At that time, Pat Garrett was a very old man, and he was described him as having completely white hair, but with his mustache still being black. So that's kind of exciting, right? Now you know someone who knows someone who knows someone who knows someone who knows Pat Garrett, who killed Billy the Kid. 5 degrees of separation, right? Now, other than those photos, there are lots of possible photos that people have put forward as being potentially Billy the Kid, but none of them have been substantiated. So far, the only 2 photos that have been officially authenticated as Billy the Kid are the ones I showed you before, but there are actually dozens of others that claim to show Billy the Kid. Some have been disproven, but others are still undergoing the verification process. So who knows, in a few years we might see a few more Billy the Kid photographs that are authenticated, but until then we just can't say. Another component of the history of the West started with a historian called Frederick Jackson Turner, who actually came up with this theory that rugged individualism on the part of white settlers shaped the West. This picture sums up a lot of the ideals that were associated with westward expansion and the Old West. This is from 1872 by the painter John Gast. It depicts the idea of westward expansion being one of spreading manifest destiny and rugged individualism out to the West. The problem is this has been debunked over and over again by subsequent historians. People who went out west were not as cut off from the east as we tend to think. It was only through government subsidized railroads, through the Homestead Act, and through support from the American government that people were able to settle the West in the first place. And so this isn't really so much rugged individualism so much as it was part of a government subsidized settlement of the American frontier. Still, the myth of the West looms large in our American imagination, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with watching John Wayne movies and enjoying the memory of the West as part of a tall tale and looking at people like Billy the Kid as Robin Hood characters, as long as we remember that that's not history. It's certainly fine to have our heroes, but we need to remember that our heroes are actually human. They may not be as exciting as we expect them to be because they're just like us. There might be kernels of truth to the myth of the West. Things were more wild out here. There were more gunfights, but the gunfights weren't like we imagine, with people standing on opposite sides of the street 10 paces apart doing some type of quick draw duel. A lot of the shootings in the West actually took place with people's backs turned. Some of the most famous gunslingers were killed by being shot in the back, because who's going to challenge a famous gunslinger to a duel and shoot them in the front? You know, they're a famous gunslinger. That seems like suicide. When we think about the Wild West, it's important to keep perspective and remember that it's not a wide open space. It wasn't empty and devoid of people. It wasn't quite as wild as we expect that it was. It didn't have this romanticism that we tend to think of it as having. However, it was a very important part of American history. It did shape who we are as a nation. It did change the shape and demographics of the United States. And it is, after all, an important part of American culture and who we are today.